Having me here in Croatia, and I want to thank Yuri Zovko as well, again. Thank you, both of you. It's been such fun visiting Croatia. It's my first visit, and you have a beautiful country here. And Zagreb and Zadar are extraordinary cities to visit, and I was particularly struck by the Roman ruins in Zadar. The antiquity of the place is impressive. So I'm going to talk today about wisdom theology in Richard Hooker. Make sure I can figure out how this thing works. There he is in a posthumous portrait by Wenceslaus Haller. All subsequent images of Hooker are more or less based on Haller's rendition of his face, but and then next to it is the title page of the first edition of the huge book that he published, part of which he published in his lifetime, and part of it was published after his death, of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. It is effectively the principal justification for the religious and constitutional arrangements of the Elizabethan settlement. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she restored all of the legislation that had been passed in the reign of Henry VIII and Edward VI that had been undone by her sister Mary. England went through a counter-reformation under Queen Mary. When Elizabeth came to the throne, the Reformed religion was restored, and it was restored by Act of Parliament, largely. The Act of Uniformity, which prescribed the Book of Common Prayer to be used throughout the realm, and the Act of Supremacy, which effectively made the Queen head of the Church. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about Richard Hooker just to start with. I like to give a biographical sketch because he may not be familiar to you, given that he's really more of perhaps a theologian or a philosophical theologian than a philosopher per se. Hooker was born in April 1554 at Heavytree near Exeter in Devonshire, and he died at Bishopsbourne, Kent, on All Souls' Day, the 2nd of November, 1600. He never made it to his 50th birthday. My theory is that he worked himself to death writing this book. He was educated at Exeter Grammar School and Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where he matriculated in 1569. I think I have an image of Corpus. There we have Corpus Christi. And his tutor was John Reynolds, later president of the college and one of the translators of the authorized version of the Bible, sometimes known as the King James Version, at least in America. Hooker gained a BA and was admitted a disciple of Corpus Christi in 1573. That's the equivalent, I suppose, today of a junior research fellowship. And in 1577, he proceeded Master of Arts and was elected a full fellow of his college in 1579. And then he was appointed deputy lecturer to Thomas Kingsmill, the Regius Professor of Hebrew. Hooker began his academic career as a Hebrew scholar. Corpus Christi was the MIT of the 16th century University of Oxford. And by that I mean they weren't doing high physics there, but it was the trilingual college in the university. Everybody who studied at Corpus had to master Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And there were other institutions of that genre throughout Europe. St. John's College in Cambridge was the trilingual college there, and it was where the most serious intellectual labor was conducted at the time. So Hooker was no slouch even from the beginning. Hooker began his career as a biblical scholar, and this was to be definitive of his career. On the 17th of March, 1585, by letters patent from the Crown and under the patronage of John Whitgift, bottom right there, Whitgift was master of Trinity College, the largest college founded by King Henry VIII at Cambridge. A great place to dine. If you ever get invited to have dinner at Trinity College, don't hesitate. Hooker was appointed master of the Temple Church at the Inns of Court. When I was in London last week, I always make a pious visit to the Temple Church. It's a round Crusaders' church, and there are images of Crusaders over their tombs in the floor. If any of you have seen the film The Da Vinci Code, there's a scene that takes place in that church, and you see these Crusaders sculpted in stone on the floor. It became, by Hooker's day, essentially the collegiate chapel of the Inns of Court. And so the job of the master of the temple was to preach sermons to English judges and lawyers who would gather there to worship on a regular basis, and still do. They have a collegial culture in the Inns of Court. The various inns have their dining halls, and you might think that you were in one of the universities when you visit the lawyers' city within the City of London at the Inns of Court. And the Temple Church was their chapel. One of the interesting things I encountered in reading about the Inns of Court was that a great pastime for lawyers in the 16th century was putting on plays. They performed plays of Shakespeare and various other dramatists of the time for one another for their entertainment. And you can imagine, I think, that there's something appropriate about play acting for lawyers. The courtroom itself is a kind of stage, and they have to master eloquence, and so play acting is probably an instructive discipline for that purpose. But I digress. Hooker shared the pulpit at the Temple Church with a Puritan by the name of Walter Travers, a radical Protestant. And Hooker would preach in the morning on Sunday, and Travers would preach in the afternoon, trying to refute everything that Hooker had said in the morning. So it was a real dialectical experience attending sermons in the Temple Church. This was in the presence of a congregation of judges and barristers. And the theological controversy that Hooker engaged in at the Temple Church was to occupy him for the rest of his life. The polemics of the pulpit exchange served as a stimulus to Hooker's composition of the Ecclesiastical Polity, which was actually commissioned by Whitgift. Richard Hooker's contribution to the theology of the English Reformation emerges in the context of polemics surrounding the implementation of the constitutional provisions of the Elizabethan settlement of 1559. His apologetic strategy in his treatise of the laws of ecclesiastical polity was largely governed by his sapiential approach. That is to say, he was effectively concentrating on the wisdom theology that can be found in books of Scripture. Hooker's wisdom theology provides the matrix within which he develops his figural reading of Holy Scripture. So I'm going to talk a bit in this paper about Hooker's hermeneutics, his figural reading of Scripture, and in the context of this sapiential theology. What is particularly noteworthy in this approach is his combination of Christian Neoplatonic metaphysics, and this is the philosophical component of the argument, with Reformed biblical hermeneutics. And it looks like this may be an attempt to square the circle, but that's what he devoted his life to. Hooker's integration of a Reformed theological perspective with his inheritance of an ancient philosophical tradition is the hallmark of his unique contribution to the later development of Anglican exegesis, liturgics, and devotion in the 17th century and later. This lecture will focus principally on Hooker's subtle and intricate configuration of God as law in the first book of his treatise. The Poetics of Law. I'm going to read. Hooker's prose has been categorized as his prose is the equivalent to Shakespeare's contribution to poetry. It's thought to be one of the most elegant expressions of the English language in a prose form. So I'm going to read you a stretch of Hooker. It's nice to listen to, I think. In sundry the works both of art and also of nature, where that which hath greatest force in the very things we see is notwithstanding itself oftentimes not seen, The stateliness of houses, the goodliness of trees, when we behold them, delighteth the eye. But that foundation which beareth up the one, that root which ministereth unto the other nourishment and life, is in the bosom of the earth concealed. And if there be at any time occasion to search into it, such labor is then more necessary than pleasant, both to them which undertake it and for the lookers on. In like manner, the use and benefit of good laws, all that live under them may enjoy with delight and comfort, albeit the grounds and first original causes from whence they have sprung be unknown, as to the greatest part of men they are. Hooker commences his discussion of the origin of law, the arche, that law which giveth life unto all the rest, with an appeal to two vivid metaphors, one artificial and one natural, a constructed foundation, a basement, and a nourishing root. And as his argument unfolds, it becomes clear that his aim in this treatise is to show that the Elizabethan and religious and constitutional settlement, the stately house, as it were, of the established church, and the goodly tree of the flourishing commonwealth, is based upon good laws, whose ultimate source is hidden altogether from view, in the bosom of the earth concealed, as he says, according to the metaphor. Is this subterranean root or foundation in any way knowable? The metaphor serves to introduce an extended analysis of the origin of law. He goes on to identify this veiled first original cause of good laws, the arche, as it were, of law, as that law whereby the eternal himself doth work. Hooker defines law in general as that which doth assign unto each thing the kind, and that which does moderate the force and power, that which does appoint the form and measure of working. And there, I think, if you analyze that sentence, you can see he's working with Aristotle's fourfold causality. Hooker goes on to affirm that the highest measure of working in the divine activity on the ground that only the works and operations of God have him both for their worker, for the law whereby they are wrought. The being of God, he maintains, is a kind of law to his working. For that perfection which God is, giveth perfection to that he doth. God, therefore, is a law, both to himself and to all other things beside. This identity of worker, work done, and the activity of working, and there I think we perhaps have an allusion to nous noesis noesios, worker, work done, and activity of working anchor the assertion of this metaphorical speech in a non-metaphorical affirmative proposition, namely that God in himself is essentially law. As Aquinas puts this in the Summa Theologica in Prima Secundae, the end of the divine government is God himself, and his law is not distinct from himself. And Hooker, I think, was an assiduous reader of Aquinas and derives portions of his argument from the Summa. In the peroration to his exposition of the nature of law and its generic division into various derivative kinds found at the end of the first book of his treatise, Hooker summarizes this argument in a striking passage evocative of the hymns of holy wisdom in the scriptures. Of law, he says, there can be no less acknowledged than that her seat is the bosom of God, her voice the harmony of the world. All things in heaven and earth do her homage, the very least as feeling her care, and the greatest as not exempted from her power. Both angels and men and creatures of what condition soever, though each in different sort and manner, yet all with uniform consent, admiring her as the mother of their peace and joy. Now, as Rowan Williams has observed, Hooker's use of the feminine pronoun in explicit reference to law would alert any scripturally literate reader to the parallel with the divine Sophia. And indeed, what Hooker claims on behalf of law, the sapiential books of Proverbs, Job, and the Wisdom of Solomon affirm of the wisdom of God, the divine Sophia. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. And then from the Wisdom of Solomon, this is one of Hooker's favorite passages in all of Scripture. Wisdom reacheth from one end to another mightily, and sweetly doth she order all things. Suaviter in Latin, Christos in Greek. It's such a beautiful sentence. For Hooker, the sapiential theologian, then, it is because God is his own wisdom that he may affirm also that God in himself, or maybe I should say God in herself, is law. A law both to himself and to all other things besides. All those things which are done by him have some end for which they are done. And the end for which they are done is the reason of his will to do them. They err, therefore, who think that of the will of God to do this or that there is no reason besides his will. And there he's taking issue with the nominalists and voluntarists, and I suppose in a way taking the realist stand alongside Thomas Aquinas against that. This claim bears comparison with Aquinas, for whom the end of the divine government is God himself, and his law is not distinct from himself. God is law. Are such claims that God is his wisdom, and consequently that God is law, mere metaphors? Are these figures of speech comparable to the stately house or the flourishing tree? Or alternatively, can definitive literal propositions about the divine nature be justifiably formed? There is perhaps something just a tiny bit transgressive about comparing God to a basement or a root, although it is clear enough that such images imply an intuitive perception of similarity in dissimilars. And as Aristotle says, it is a great thing to be a master of metaphor. And Hooker surely is. The similarity of God to a basement, the foundation of a dwelling, is of course concealment from view. To propose that God is himself in some sense actually law or wisdom is not on the same metaphorical footing, so to speak. In question 13 of the prima pars of the Summa on the names of God, Aquinas asks in Article 3 whether all names applied to God must needs be metaphorical, or whether some can be applied in a literal sense. Aquinas argues that true affirmative propositions can be formed about God. This assertion depends upon drawing a distinction between signification in reality, what it is in itself, or in se, as Aquinas puts it, and what it is for us, pro nobis, in idea. God, as considered in himself, in se, is altogether one and simple, and yet our intellect knows him by different conceptions because it cannot see him as he is in himself. Hence, diverse names are ascribed to God. God is one, good, infinite, just, compassionate, and so on. While it is possible to affirm diverse essential qualities or predicates, our intellect knows that in reality, one and the same simple object corresponds to these conceptions. The perfect unity of God requires that what are manifold and divided in others should exist in him, simply and unitedly. Thus it comes about that he is one in reality and yet multiple in idea, because our intellect apprehends him in a manifold manner as things represent him. Consequently, the plurality of predicate and subject, in Hooker's case, law and God, represents the plurality of idea. Nonetheless, for the intellect, pro nobis, this plurality represents unity by composition, that is, by predication. God is law. For Hooker, the primordial wisdom is the law which God hath eternally purposed himself in all his works to observe. This law is the highest wellspring and fountain. And here we have a Plotinian image. The fountain, the source of all derivative species of law. Hooker agrees with Aquinas when he speaks of the radical simplicity of God in himself, when he states that God is one, or rather very oneness, and mere unity, having nothing but itself in itself, and not consisting, as all other things do besides God, of many things. This is an emphasis of on the Tawhid of the Islamic philosophers. Of the divine simplicity, says Hooker, our soundest knowledge is to know that we know him not as indeed he is, neither can know him. And our safest eloquence concerning him is our silence, when we confess without confession that his glory is inexplicable, his greatness above our capacity to reach. He is above and we upon earth, and therefore it behooveth our words to be wary and few. So here we have Hooker, the apophatic theologian. As first original cause, the first eternal law has her seat in the bosom of God. Simultaneously, this original eternal law, in its unity, contains within itself a plurality of multiple derivative species of law. As offspring of God, all things which God hath made are in him as effects in their highest cause. He likewise actually is in them. The assistance and influence of his deity is their life. And so it is with original law and its diverse derivative laws. Hooker proceeds to distinguish between a first and second eternal law, and this is where he parts company with Aquinas. The latter, the second eternal law, is the ordering voice of the divine wisdom. Law as God's utterance, proceeding from the ineffable unity of the first eternal law and comprising within it all derivative finite species of law which participate the eternal law as discrete emanations ordered dispositively in hierarchical procession, while the first eternal law is the original self-constituting divine source as it remains ineffably simple at unity with itself. That is to say, as God's very oneness. By eternal law, the learned for the most part do understand the order, not which God has eternally purposed himself in all his works to observe, but rather that which with himself he has set down as expedient to be kept by all creatures, according to the several conditions wherewith he has endued them. All things, therefore, which are as they ought to be, are conformed to this second eternal law, and even those things which to this eternal law are not conformable are notwithstanding in some sort ordered by the first eternal law. It is the second eternal law whose voice is the harmony of the world, as distinct from the prior law whose place is in the divine bosom. So the first eternal law in the divine bosom, the second eternal law is the harmony of the world. The second eternal law does not work infinitely, but rather correspondently to that end, that finite end for which it works, even all things Christos, suaviter, in most decent and comely sort. Hooker's account of the eternal law as simultaneously unity and radical simplicity, and participation of that unity by a multiplicity of derivative forms of law, recapitulates the ontology of causality set out by Proclus in his Elements of Theology, whereby every effect remains in its cause, proceeds from it, and reverts to it. For Proclus, the totality of reality beneath the one or the good itself is structured by mone, that is remaining and abiding, prohodos, procession, going forth, and epistrophe, return or conversion. All reality is in the one, proceeds from the one, and returns to the one, is converted back towards its source when it achieves its proper good. In Hooker's formulation, this double motion of procession and return, what Aquinas refers to as the exitus and reditus, is remarkably similar. Every effect, says Hooker, doth after a sort contain, at leastwise resemble the cause from which it proceedeth. All things in the world are said in some sort to seek the highest and to covet more or less the participation of God himself. Hooker anchors his elaborate exposition and defense of the Elizabethan religious settlement in a metaphysical theory of law which itself assumes a Neoplatonic ontology of participation in the Proclean tradition. All things are therefore partakers of God. They are his offspring, His influence is in them, and the personal wisdom of God is for that very cause said to excel in nimbleness and agility, to pierce into all intellectual, pure, and subtle spirits, to go through all, and to reach unto everything that is. All things which God in their times and seasons hath brought forth were eternally and before all times in God, as a work unbegun is in the artificer, which afterward bringeth it unto effect. Therefore, whatsoever we do behold now in this present world, it was enwrapped within the bowels of divine mercy, written in the book of eternal wisdom, and yet in the hands of omnipotent power, the first foundations of the world being as yet unlaid. Hooker's apophatic emphasis on law as it is written in the book of eternal wisdom, having her seat in the bosom of God, raises doubt about whether God can be named literally as either wisdom or law. The extraordinary metaphor of the bowels of divine mercy intimates that creation may be viewed as tantamount to a divine excretion. I hope you'll excuse that. Is it possible to speak significantly about the first eternal law? Or is Hooker confined to solely figurative language? After all, of God's very oneness we confess without confession that his glory is inexplicable, his greatness above our capacity to reach. And as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite asserts in his treatise on the divine names, of him there is neither name nor can one be found of him. What an extraordinary way to begin a treatise on the divine names, to say that God has no name. Ambrose of Milan, on the other hand, maintains ambivalently that some names there are which express evidently the property of the divinity, and some which express the clear truth of the divine majesty, but others there are which are applied to God metaphorically by way of similitude. This is the common sense Roman approach. Aquinas asks whether all names are applied to God solely in a metaphorical sense, or whether any can be applied literally. The names of creatures are applied to God metaphorically, as when we say God is a stone, or a lion, or the like. And after some discussion, Aquinas eventually concludes that some names of God can be applied in an affirmative and literal sense. There are some names which signify these perfections flowing from God to creatures in such a way that the imperfect way in which creatures receive the divine perfection is part of the very signification of the name itself, as stone signifies a material being. And names of this kind can be applied to God only in a metaphorical sense. Other names, however, express these perfections absolutely, without any such mode of participation being part of their signification, as the words being, good, living, and the like, and such names can be literally applied to God. So there it seems that Aquinas is siding with Ambrose against Dionysius. Law and wisdom are such names as express an essential property of the divinity. The perfect unity of God requires that what are manifold and divided in others should exist in him, simply and unitedly. Thus it comes about that he is one in reality and yet multiple in idea, because our intellect apprehends him in a manifold manner, as things represent him. And so it is with the wisdom of God read out, as it were, in the manifold species of law. Now, according to Hooker, the second eternal law, whose voice is the harmony of the world, comprises the manifold divine order as kept by all of God's creatures, according to the several conditions wherewith he hath endued them. This law has a variety of names, depending on the different orders of creatures subject to the one divine government. The two principal derivative genera of the second eternal law are, first, the natural law, and secondly, the revealed law of the scriptures, the latter sometimes termed by Hooker the divine law. And the divine law in Hooker is not to be confused with the eternal law. The divine law is a derivative genus from the eternal law and refers to the sacred oracles of Scripture. The entire system of the laws comprised within this second eternal law thus expresses the Proclean twofold motion of creative procession from, the prohodos, and the return to, the epistrophe, the procession from and the return to the original unity of the eternal law, as expressed by this primary division between the natural and the revealed orders of law. Each of these two primary genera, natural law and revealed law, is further participated by multiple derivative and dependent forms. The natural law, by way of a further procession, comprises in turn subordinate species of law which govern irrational natural agents as well as the rational. The law governing the rational creatures is distinguished further into the law celestial, which orders the angels, and the law of reason, sometimes identified rather confusingly as the natural law simply, which orders rational humankind. All of these subspecies represent the outward unfolding, or processio ad extra, of the second eternal law, reaching from one end to another end mightily. Now that law, which as it is laid up in the bosom of God they call eternal, receiveth according unto the different kinds of things which are subject unto it, different and sundry kinds of names. That part of it which ordereth natural agents we call usually nature's law. That which angels do clearly behold, and without any swerving observe, is a law celestial and heavenly. The law of reason, that which bindeth creatures reasonable in this world, and with which by reason they may most plainly perceive themselves bound, that which bindeth them and is not known but by special revelation from God, divine law. Human law, that which out of the law either of reason or of God, men probably gathering to be expedient, they make it a law. On the converse side of the second eternal law, the law of God's special revelation, the revealed law of the Scriptures, presupposes the disorder introduced into the cosmos by the fall. And here is the Augustinian moment in Hooker's theology. The revealed law of Scripture is provided in order to secure a final restoration or return, an epistrophe, one would say, in Proclus, of the creation to its original condition of unity under and within the primordial first eternal law. Hooker's distinction between these two summa genera of natural law and revealed law corresponds to the cosmic logic of procession and return, but also reflects the epistemological distinction of a twofold knowledge of God, a duplex cognitio Dei in Calvin's formulation, namely by the light of supernatural revelation and by the natural light of reason. In addition to the book of eternal wisdom, Hooker will refer to the book of nature and the book of Scripture, three books corresponding to three genera of law. There are, moreover, composite species of law, such as human positive law and the law of nations, the jus gentium, for example, which derive from a conscious, pragmatic reflection upon the general principles contained in the natural law. The classic illustration here is natural law counsels the preservation of human life, but positive law decrees that everybody will drive on the right-hand side of the road and that there will be a stop sign or a light to regulate the traffic here or there. That's positive law. But it's dependent upon the natural law. These additional derivative species of law are viewed by Hooker, here following Augustine, as a consequence of human sin, presupposing the fall, and like the divine law, they also constitute a corrective to the disorder introduced by Adam's disobedience. Augustine speaks of such a law as a remedy of sin, remedium peccati. That is in the City of God, in the 19th book. Augustine speaks of such law as remedium peccati, and throughout this complex legal discourse, Hooker presents the human creature as the imago Dei, at the focal point of the cosmic drama of procession from and return to the original fount of order established in the divine simplicity of the first eternal law. In the second book of the Ecclesiastical Polity, Hooker addresses the definition and limits of the authority of Scripture. The ways of wisdom are of sundry kinds, so her manner of teaching is not merely one and the same. Some things she openeth by the sacred books of Scripture, some things by the glorious works of nature, the theatre of glory. With some things she inspireth them from above by a spiritual influence. In some things she leadeth and traineth them only by worldly experience and practice. we may not so in any one special kind admire her that we disgrace her in any other, but let all her ways be according unto their place and degree adored. This comment could be understood as being directed straight at Walter Travers, who in his Puritan biblicizing mode thought that the constitution of the church ought to be derived solely from sacred scripture and not in any way dependent upon reason or tradition. And that, in Hooker's view, was a dishonoring of the divine wisdom, that he would not allow for the authority of inherited practice and tradition or the authority of reason in the constitution of the church. As intellectual creatures, mortals share the desire of the angels for an infinite good, in which alone such a nature can be finally satisfied. Then are we happy, therefore, when fully we enjoy God as an object wherein the powers of our souls are satisfied with everlasting delight, so that although we be men, yet by being unto God united, we live, as it were, the life of God. And this is as close as Hooker comes to expressing an explicit doctrine of theosis, or divinization, to live the life of God. Yet, of such perfection capable we are not in this life. For while we are in the world, subject we are unto sundry imperfections, griefs of body, defects of mind. Yea, the best things we do are painful. No doubt the writing of this book. The predicament of the human condition is to be of a mixed nature, partaking of both an intellectual nature shared by the angels and the physical nature shared by the irrational necessary agents. The human is composite. For Hooker, there can be no natural overcoming of this hiatus between a natural desire for divine perfection and a complete natural incapacity to achieve the end desired. This, by the way, is Paul's cross that was mentioned by Lees in the, if I could just sort of leave my paper for a minute and point out what's going on here. This is the birthplace of the public sphere in England, I think. Every Sunday, a clergyman, usually a fellow of an Oxford or Cambridge college, or one of the bishops or one of the canons of Westminster, would be invited by the mayor and alderman of the City of London, or even by the Privy Council. There's the king up there with Anne of Denmark, his wife, and Prince Arthur. These are bishops, and these three here are High Court judges. The members of the guilds of the City of London are here in the pit. It looks a bit like a theater. I mean, they're, you know, these are the nickel seats, and this is the gallery. This space was called the Sermon House. One of the most, it's not visible from this image, but one of the most interesting features of Paul's cross is that all of the publishing houses, or not almost all of the publishing houses of London, are in Paul's churchyard and are visible from the pulpit. So the word that goes, you might say, from the preacher to the congregation there finds its way eventually into print through these various publishing houses that are there. And that's the sense in which we have a kind of public space appearing in London. It's a space that's associated with the liberties of the city. Unlike the Royal Abbey of Westminster, this is a space that belongs to the citizens of the City of London. It's considered to be a place of liberty. Rebellion against the crown was often organized from this spot. Simon de Montfort led his rebellion from Paul's churchyard. And you can visit, the pulpit was demolished in the 1640s, and nobody really knows how it came to be demolished. Some people blame William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who thought that sedition was being preached from that pulpit, and some blame the Cromwell and the Puritans for demolishing it because they thought it was too tightly under the control of the crown. But it's interesting that conflict of crown and parliament is in some way implicated in the institution of a pulpit. This church burned in the Great Fire of London. It was replaced by a magnificent structure designed by Sir Christopher Wren. But when you visit St. Paul's Cathedral, there's actually a marker, so you can actually go to that precise spot. It's at the northeast corner of the cathedral. But it's a remarkable place in the early modern history of England. And I have other things to say about it, but I will not encroach on your patience by whittering on about Paul's Cross. I've been working on Paul's Cross for the last several years, and I managed to squeeze 3 books out of it. It's a very inspiring place to consider. So, to return to my paper, I'm very near the end now. While the desire for theosis, or divinization, is a natural desire, so that nature, even in this life, doth plainly claim and call for a more divine perfection, as Hooker says. Nonetheless, the light of nature is never able to find any way of obtaining the reward of bliss, but by performing exactly the duties and works of righteousness. And here is Hooker, the Reformed theologian, showing his hand. From salvation, therefore, and life, all flesh being excluded this way, behold how the wisdom of God hath revealed a way mystical and supernatural, a way directing unto the same end of life by a course which groundeth itself upon the guiltiness of sin, and through sin desert of condemnation and death. And Hooker will go on at length in one of his sermons to explain how in his soteriology, the only hope for salvation is justification by faith only. Hooker is a Lutheran when it comes to soteriology. The exitus reditus structure of the generic division of law in Book 1 shows that Hooker has read Aquinas on law closely. Hooker's distinction between the first and second eternal laws constitutes, nonetheless, a highly significant departure from the Thomist scholastic model. The effect of the distinction between the two aspects of the eternal law is simultaneously to widen and to decrease the distance between the creator lawgiver and the created cosmos. In addition, the distance between the two principal aspects of the second eternal law, that is to say between natural law and revealed law, is most pronounced in Hooker's account of soteriology. The final epistrophe, or return to God of all creation, can only be by a way mystical and supernatural, that is to say, by way of faith and not by works. In Notes Toward a Fragment on Predestination, a manuscript in the library of Trinity College Dublin, Hooker distinguishes between 2 species of divine governance. And here, corresponding to a duplex cognitio Dei, we have a duplex gubernatio Dei. Government is that work whereby government is the work of God whereby he sustains created things and disposes all things to the end which he naturally chooses, that is, the greatest good, which, given the law of creation, can be elicited. For given the law of creation, it was not fitting that creation be violated through those things which follow from creation. So God does nothing by his government which offends against that which he has framed and ratified by the very act of creation. The government of God is general over all, special over rational creatures. There are 2 forms of government, duplex gubernatio Dei. That which would have been had free creation not lost its way, and that which is now when it has lost its way. This passage reveals the soteriological principle underlying the generic division of laws. On the one side are laws governing the order of an unfallen creation, and among these laws Hooker includes the law of nature insofar as it governs irrational and non-voluntary natural agents. This again is a significant departure from the usual more restricted sense of natural law as an intellectual habit of the soul, that is to say, the summa ratio as it is present and known to rational creatures, which is more how Aquinas treats, and also Cicero treats the notion of the natural law. To conclude, for Hooker, the form of law to be kept by all creatures according to their several conditions is comprised within these 3 summa genera, the eternal law, the natural law, and the revealed law, where the latter 2 species are understood as comprehended within the first, and yet nonetheless distinct both in their operation and in our knowledge of them. Together, these summa genera constitute a comprehensive division of the diversity of law. To understand their derivation from the original unity of the first eternal law is to gain critical insight into the underlying ontological assumptions of Hooker's argument. And I would argue that these are Proclean assumptions. And moreover provides a vital instrument for interpreting the manner of Hooker's reconciliation of Neoplatonic ontology and Reformed soteriology. Viewed from the standpoint of their divine principle of origin, that is to say, the first eternal law being the being of God is a law to his working, these three summa genera of law may be considered as simply one, in themselves one. The predication of law to God is not metaphorical for Hooker. Law is a perfection of the divine being and can consequently be affirmed literally, so long as we understand that what God is in reality is not to be confused what he is in idea. Our intellect apprehends God in the manifold manner of the expression of the voice of his wisdom. Viewed from below, as it were, that is from the standpoint of mortal finitude, the original unity takes on the aspect of articulated multiplicity of kinds, which nonetheless all participate and proceed from the undivided unity that is their common source, mone. This account of the simultaneous unity and diversity of law in its multiple species lies at the heart of Hooker's vision of law as an expression of the divine governance. Who the guide of nature, but only the God of nature? And here I think we see an anticipation of English Enlightenment. If you've ever come across the book by Frederick Beiser called The Sovereignty of Reason, Beiser traces the English Enlightenment to Hooker, among others, in their reflections on natural theology. Natural theology is a kind of a starting point for an enlightened approach to philosophy. Who the guide of nature, but only the God of nature, in him we live, move, and are. Those things which nature is said to do are by divine art performed, using nature as an instrument. Nor is there any such art or knowledge divine in nature herself working, but in the guide of nature's work. And there again we have that feminine pronoun. Hooker begins with metaphors of the nature of law in general, law as the root of a nourishing tree, law as the foundation of a stately house, law as a wellspring or fountain, all hidden in the bosom of the earth. And he proceeds to identify these underlying hidden sources with the primordial Sophia of God. This wisdom is in turn presented metaphorically as hidden in the bosom of God, in the bowels of the divine mercy, and manifest in the voice of cosmic harmony. In effect, when we mix these metaphors, what is hidden in the bosom of the earth is in actuality hidden in the bosom of God. The conclusion for Hooker is that God, in some literal sense, is law. His law is not distinct from himself, and therefore it becomes possible to move beyond metaphor to a more literal affirmation. This predication must be interpreted cautiously. It is composite in form, but refers the theological understanding to an essential simplicity, the ineffable unity and simplicity of all law in the divine, self-regulating Trinitarian activity. The being of God is a kind of law to his working, and on this working a manifold diversity of laws depend. Thank you.